This episode of Thinking in English is sponsored by the amazing podcast English Learning for Curious Minds. English Learning for Curious Minds is one of the best podcasts for English learners, has fantastic topics, and I think Thinking in English listeners would love it. English Learning for Curious Minds helps you to improve your language skills. You can learn from fascinating stories, develop your listening skills, and access unique interactive transcripts, subtitles, and key vocabulary. Ever wondered about why cocktails have unusual names? Want to learn about a famous Soviet spy ring in the UK? Or are you curious about Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who killed a US president? All of these have been recent topics on English Learning for Curious Minds. I can't recommend English Learning for Curious Minds more highly. Make sure you check out the podcast, available on all podcast platforms right now. Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. Earlier this month, Finland became the 31st member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. Today, I want to explain the origins of NATO, its purpose, and discuss why Finland's joining is a significant move. You can find the full transcript of this episode over on the Thinking in English blog. The link is in the description. Check out my Instagram page and YouTube channel, both called Thinking in English. Head over to Patreon to support the podcast and join my conversation groups. And here is today's vocabulary list. Accession. Accession. The time when a country officially joins a group of countries or signs an agreement. For example, Sweden's accession to NATO is still being considered. Alliance. Alliance. A group of countries, political parties, or people who have agreed to work together because of shared interests or aims. For instance, NATO is sometimes called the Atlantic Alliance. To reel. To reel. If you reel, or your mind or brain reels, you feel very confused or shocked and unable to act. For instance, we were reeling from the news that we had won all of that money. Meaningful. Meaningful. Useful, serious, or important. As in, she seems to find it difficult to form meaningful relationships. Collective. Collective. Done or shared by every member of a group. For example, it will require a collective effort from government, providers, and the media to meet our goals. To deter. To deter. To prevent someone from doing something or to make someone less enthusiastic about doing something by making it difficult for that person to do it or by threatening bad results if they do it. For example, these measures are designed to deter an enemy attack. To constitute. To constitute. To form or make something. As in, the under-18s constitute nearly 25% of the town's population. Non-alignment. Non-alignment. If a country is non-aligned, it does not support or depend on any powerful country or group of countries. For example, non-alignment was previously Finland's main policy. Finland has officially become the 31st member of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Finnish flag was raised over the organization's headquarters on Tuesday, April 4th, after the Finnish foreign minister handed over the Accession documents. After decades of a policy called non-alignment, Finland finally made a decision to apply for NATO membership last year in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. NATO is a military alliance of countries from Europe and North America, originally founded to counter the power of the Soviet Union and its allies. The invasion of Ukraine caused a big change in political and public opinion in Finland, with up to 80% of Finnish people supporting the country's application to NATO. Both Sweden and Finland applied to join at the same time, although Sweden's application is currently delayed after objections by the Turkish government. While Finland's entry into NATO has been positively received in many Western countries, the choice will anger Russia. In the years leading up to Russia's attack on its neighbour Ukraine, the government and President Vladimir Putin have been vocal in their anger at NATO's expansion in the east of Europe. While many scholars suggested that the attack on Ukraine was an attempt to weaken NATO forever, it appears Russia has failed in its aims. NATO's border with Russia has now doubled, with the addition of Finland's 1,340 kilometers. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken even went as far to say, "This is maybe the one thing we can thank Mr. Putin for, because he once again here has precipitated something he claims to want to prevent by Russia's aggression." Today, I want to look at NATO in more detail. What is NATO? Why was it formed? Who are its members and what's its purpose? Let's try to answer these questions today. In 1945, the Second World War ended in Europe. Rather than being a unified and strong Europe, there was a major ideological division in the continent. The communist Soviet Union had marched through Eastern Europe on their way to taking over Berlin, and they continued to occupy much of the continent. The world was still reeling from the devastation of the war, and tensions were high between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. The capitalist countries of Western Europe feared both the growing power and influence of the Soviet Union and the chance of more aggression from Germany. They decided that they needed a permanent military alliance to allow them to better defend against their enemies. In 1948, the UK, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg signed the Brussels Pact and formed a military alliance called the Western European Union. However, these Western European countries were badly damaged by the costs of war and understood that any meaningful military alliance would require the support of the North American powers Canada and especially the United States. The United States also feared the influence of communism. Socialist and communist parties were becoming increasingly popular in places like France, and it seemed that Soviet armies may be seeking to expand into other parts of Europe. The Soviet Union had already established communist regimes in several Eastern European countries, and there was a concern that they would continue to push westward. The Berlin blockade in the late 1940s signalled that there would be difficulties and conflict between the two ideological sides. On April 5, 1949, 12 Western countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, a military and defensive alliance designed to combat the Soviet Union. NATO's core purpose is to deter aggression against its member states and to respond collectively to any attacks. This is enshrined in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which states that an attack on one member state will be considered an attack on all member states, and that each member state will take action to assist the attacked state, including the use of armed force if necessary. In other words, If you attack a member of NATO, you're attacking all members of NATO, and all members of NATO will defend. This was very important at the time NATO was founded. Europe was struggling to rebuild destroyed infrastructure and deal with the legacies of war. If a country like France or the UK was attacked, it was not certain whether they would have the strength to defend themselves again. Collective security, however, guaranteed that if one member was attacked, all members, especially including the United States, would provide military support. In addition to collective defense, NATO has a broader set of objectives and purposes, many of them more important today. These include promoting stability and security in Europe and the Atlantic, strengthening the rule of law and promoting economic prosperity, supporting crisis management and peacekeeping operations, countering terrorism, and strengthening international security. The Cold War, which lasted from the 1940s to the early 1990s, was a period of intense geopolitical competition and ideological conflict between the United States and its Western allies and the Soviet Union and its communist allies. NATO played a critical role in balancing Soviet expansion and aggression, and maintaining peace and stability in Europe during this time. One of the main ways that NATO worked to contain the Soviet Union was through deterrence. NATO developed a strategy of massive retaliation, which involved the threat of nuclear response to any Soviet attack. This strategy was intended to deter the Soviet Union from initiating an attack in the first place, and involved placing nuclear weapons in Europe. In addition to deterrence, NATO also worked to strengthen its military capabilities and preparedness. The organization established a military command structure and developed strategies for defense and deterrence, including the deployment of troops and military training. While the Cold War was a time of great tension and uncertainty, NATO's role in containing the Soviet Union helped to prevent any global conflicts and maintained peace and stability in Europe. With the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, NATO expanded and changed its approach to defense. The organization initially consisted of 12 member states, but it has since grown to include 30 member countries, actually 31 including Finland. One of the key moments in NATO's expansion was the inclusion of new members from Central and Eastern Europe in the 1990s and early 2000s. These countries had previously been part of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence, some of them even in the Soviet Union's version of NATO, the Warsaw Pact. And their inclusion in NATO was seen as a significant step towards the integration of Europe. NATO's mission and activities have also evolved over time. In the post-Cold War era, the organization began to engage in a wide range of security activities, including peacekeeping and humanitarian operations. Now, let's discuss a few examples of NATO actions in recent years, or kind of recent years. The Kosovo War. The Kosovo War occurred in 1998 and 1999 in the Serbian province of Kosovo, which was experiencing tensions between the majority Albanian population and the Serbian government. The Yugoslav government, led by President Slobodan Milosevic, launched a campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Albanian population, which involved forced expulsions, killings, and other atrocities. In response to these developments, NATO launched a military operation against Yugoslavia, called Operation Allied Force. The objective was to halt the violence and protect the Albanian population in Kosovo. The operation involved a 78-day bombing campaign against the Yugoslav military and strategic targets, such as government buildings, communication networks, and military installations. The bombing campaign was controversial, with some critics arguing that it violated international law and constituted an act of aggression against a sovereign state. However, supporters of the operation argued it was necessary to prevent further human rights abuses and destabilization in the region. The bombing campaign ultimately achieved its objectives, as Yugoslav forces withdrew from Kosovo in June 1999, paving the way for international peacekeeping forces led by the United Nations. And today, Kosovo is virtually an independent country, competing in football World Cup qualifyings, having its own government, and its independence and membership of the UN potential in the future, although it is objected by Serbia and Russia. The Kosovo War marked a significant turning point in NATO's history, as it was the first time the organisation had launched a military operation against the state without the approval of the United Nations Security Council. The Afghanistan War. The Afghanistan War began in 2001 after the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the United States. The attacks were carried out by the Al-Qaeda terrorist group, which was based in Afghanistan and supported the Taliban regime that controlled the country. In response to the attacks, NATO invoked Article 5 of its treaty for the first time, which states that an attack against one member is an attack against all. This led to the deployment of NATO troops to Afghanistan, with the aim of overthrowing the Taliban regime and dismantling Al-Qaeda's infrastructure. The NATO-led mission in Afghanistan, called the International Security Assistance Force, was the largest military operation in NATO's history. It involved troops from over 50 countries, including the US, the UK, Germany, and Canada. The war was initially successful in removing the Taliban regime from power and disrupting Al-Qaeda's operations in Afghanistan. But the conflict soon turned into a long insurgency, with the Taliban and other militant groups launching a guerrilla war against NATO and Afghan government forces. The war was also controversial, with some critics arguing that it was an unwinnable conflict that had cost too many lives and resources. The conflict was marked by frequent reports of civilian casualties and human rights abuses, as well as allegations of corruption and incompetence on the part of the Afghan government. NATO formally ended its mission in Afghanistan in 2014, but continued to provide training and support to Afghan security forces. But the security situation in the country remained unstable, with the Taliban controlling much of the country. In 2021, NATO announced its withdrawal from Afghanistan, marking the end of its 2-decade involvement in the conflict. Now, Finland becoming the 31st member of NATO is a significant development in the security landscape of Northern Europe. Finland, which shares a long border with Russia, has traditionally pursued a military policy of non-alignment, and has maintained friendly relations with both NATO and Russia. But in recent years, Finland has expressed concern about Russia's increasingly assertive behaviour in the region, including its annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine a year ago, the government and population of Finland were finally convinced to apply for full membership of the security alliance. Alongside Sweden, who have not been allowed to join just yet, they decided that the benefits of NATO outweighed the negatives. Joining NATO will provide Finland with a formal security guarantee from the world's most powerful military alliance, which could act as a deterrent against any potential aggression from Russia. It will also allow Finland to participate more fully in NATO-led military operations and exercises, as well as benefit from intelligence sharing and cooperation on security and other security-related issues. But joining NATO may also have drawbacks for Finland, including increasing tensions with Russia and a possibility in the future of a military confrontation. It could also strain Finland's historically neutral stance and potentially affect its economic ties with Russia. So here is today's final thought. Since the 1940s, NATO has played an important role in maintaining European security and peace. The expansion of the organization in the 1990s and 2000s angered Russia, and perhaps was one of the motivations for the invasion of Ukraine. Finland joining is a significant development, both providing Finland with an extra layer of security and doubling NATO's border with Russia. In the next months and years, NATO could grow even more, with the possible admission of Sweden and Ukraine. What do you think? Is NATO still an important organization today? Has Russia's invasion of Ukraine given NATO renewed motivation and importance? What's your opinions on NATO? And try to be balanced when you leave comments about this topic. I know some of you might really dislike NATO or really love NATO. Try to be nice when you leave comments or interact with other Thinking in English listeners. I don't want any arguments or mean comments, please. But thank you for listening to this episode, listening today. I hope you all enjoyed listening. If you want to leave a comment, you can. You can leave comments on Spotify, the Thinking in English transcript on the blog, or also send me a message on Instagram as well. Please check out my YouTube channel and my Instagram page. You can support the podcast by subscribing to me on Patreon and joining my conversation groups and listening to bonus episodes and just helping me turn Thinking in English into a business. And I think that's everything. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.